Welcome to the Road to Zero podcast. I'm your host, Nick LeBlanc, founder of Network Potential Consulting. We're here to explore the fast emerging zero impact economy, which is transforming the way we do business, bringing prosperity and regenerating the natural world in the process. And I invite you to look at how you can position your business at the forefront of this global movement. Today on the Road to Zero, we're talking to Jason Vallis, Vice President of External Relations or Planetary Technology, and he's joining us from Ottawa, Ontario. Welcome, Jim, and thank you for being with us.
Nick, thanks for having me.
Now, you had a very long career with both the Canadian Armed Forces and the Federal Public Service. Now, what got you to jump into a startup, taking on accelerating the carbon economy and shifting the chemistry of the ocean?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess I have to go back to first of all, my own childhood. And so I guess my passion for environment and sustainability comes from being raised in the country, getting to explore the great outdoors and appreciating the environment. My parents were also very much of the mindset of leave it better than you found it. And so that was, sort of my mindset growing up. But really the transition to a startup, that big leap, started about 10 years ago. When I decided that I wanted to make sustainable energy and policy a full-time career. I went back to school, I upgraded my engineering, and then a couple of years after that, I had my first child, which really solidified the need for me to direct all of my energy towards this massive problem that we have to solve, which is climate change. So I was very fortunate. As I left the Canadian Armed Forces, I was able to transition to the Federal Public Service, where I worked at the Office of Energy Research and Development, as you mentioned in the intro there. And I got a very good overview of sort of the energy innovation ecosystem in Canada. We were funding over 400 different projects, both federally, internally, as well as externally. And I got a really good view of sort of, the real challenge ahead of us in terms of decarbonization. I recognized that without any experience in the private sector, I was still lacking something. I didn't quite understand what made some companies succeed and others not succeed. And so I went back to school for a third time. I did my MBA and ultimately decided to, the best way to learn is to join a startup. And I was very fortunate to know the CEO and co-founder of Planetary. And so I joined them in the fall of 2020. And it's been a roller coaster of a ride since.
Tell us a bit more about Planetary. I noticed they're founded in 2019, so a fairly recent company. So what are they about, and what you guys are up to?
Yeah, you're right. So we're a young startup. I guess we're just entering into our third year of operations. As you mentioned, the company was founded in 2019 by our co-founders, CEO Mike Kelland and Dr. Greg Rao, as well as Brock Batacchio, who's a renewable energy engineer. The company really has one primary mission, which is to remove carbon from the air. The way that we're doing that is through an electrochemical approach that was developed by our co-founder and CTO, Dr. Greg Rao. So I can get more into the details of that, but yeah, we've had quite a successful first 2 years, I would say, as a company. We've been able to prove our technology at the bench scale. We're now moving up to piloting. And we've grown the team from, the four initial co-founders to a team of 15, dedicated engineers, entrepreneurs, scientists who are actively working at how we can solve this problem of removing carbon from the atmosphere.
And I can see you have a pretty big goal. Was it 1 billion tons of CO2 removed by 2035, I believe?
Yeah, that is our goal. This is a huge challenge. The IPCC has come out and said pretty clearly that if we're going to reach net zero, we need to capture and remove 10 billion tons of carbon annually by mid-century. So the way that we look at that is that in order to have a solution that is going to be, take a chunk out of that, we need to be looking at 1 billion tons. We need to start with that in mind and do everything that we are doing today to scale up to that goal. So we have said that we want to reach 1 billion tons of removal by 2035. It's a very, very ambitious goal, but that's what we are working towards.
And tell us a bit about the technology. I believe you call the process the accelerated carbon transmission platform. So tell us more about how exactly you go about doing that.
Yeah, so I'll just correct you a little bit. So it's Accelerated Carbon Transition Platform, and yes, it is. It's an electrochemical approach, a geoelectrochemical approach to carbon removal. So basically, the science relies on enhanced weathering and ocean alkalinity enhancement. And so there's a number of stages of the technology, starting with stages of development, and then also stages within the process. So we actually start with mine tailings or mine waste, which is silicate rocks that are already dug up out of the earth. And we use those tailings to extract the feedstock for our electrochemical process, which, combined with renewable energy and water, allows us to produce hydrogen, which is why we were formerly called Planetary Hydrogen. Some of your listeners might be familiar with planetary hydrogen as a byproduct, but also a form of mild alkalinity. And that alkalinity, with a pure form of alkalinity, is then shipped to coastal outfalls, where we introduce that to seawater in order to enhance the alkalinity of the ocean. I think your listeners will know that the oceans have been a huge buffer when it comes to climate change. In fact, they've been absorbing up to a third of all of the man-made emissions that we've put into the atmosphere. A third of those end up in the oceans, and they're actually they're acidifying the ocean. So by adding alkalinity, we can actually counter that ocean acidification, restore ocean chemistry. And in the process, we're reacting that dissolved carbon dioxide with the alkalinity to produce stable carbonates and bicarbonates, which is effectively how we store carbon within the ocean.
So the way you're getting the carbon is this alkalinity substance that you're creating, you're putting in the ocean. And of course, the ocean's already absorbed all that CO2, which makes it more acidic. What happens to the CO2? Does it get locked in a different form or fall down to what happens to the CO2 in that process?
Yeah, exactly. So the carbon dioxide that's already dissolved in the ocean ends up reacting with the alkalinity that we introduce and forms those carbonates and bicarbonates that I mentioned. And eventually, over eons, settles to the bottom of the ocean as sediments and will come back up through volcanic action. This is what you would call the slow carbon cycle or geochemical carbon cycle. It's the reason why today we have the oceans are actually the largest reservoir of carbon on the Earth's surface. Something like 88% of carbon is in the form of these carbonates and bicarbonates within ocean chemistry. So the oceans, definitely have to be a part of the climate solution. But I think what's interesting is that it's only recent that we've seen sort of more mainstream efforts to recognize that and to push the fact that we need to do a lot more research and look at the oceans as a possible solution. I mean, it only makes logical sense. I mean, I mentioned that it's the largest reservoir of carbon on the Earth's surface. It's also over 70% of the Earth's surface. So the oceans naturally left on their own rather, will eventually draw down all of the carbon that we've emitted into the atmosphere. The issue is that it would take thousands and thousands of years, which we don't have. And so our process basically looks to accelerate that natural process of enhanced rock weathering, formation of carbonates and bicarbonates, which end up in ocean chemistry.
Yeah, really nice, elegant, long-term solution, and imagine too, it deals with the whole issue of ocean acidification itself is a problem, right? I know on this coast, I'm on the West Coast, and we have issues with some of our shellfish cultures where the shells aren't being broken down, and it's actually being quite an issue.
You're right; it's devastating, and one of our research partners with the University of Miami is actually looking at the impacts of ocean acidification and heating on things like coral reefs. And stats out there that say we're going to lose half of our coral reefs as we see the increase in temperature and acidification of our oceans. So, we need to not only worry about how we deal with carbon in the atmosphere, but we have to do that in a way, like you said, that's thoughtful and thinks about the environmental effects of how we're going to do it. So if we can have a process like the Accelerated Carbon Transition Platform, which can help to deacidify the ocean. Some studies have shown actually increase the resilience of coral reefs to things like ocean warming through alkalinity enhancement. Then we think that this is a good way to go. It's a good way to kind of kill two birds with one stone. And if you take it one step further, or I should say, feed two birds with one scone, as our office manager likes to say. But you could take it one step further. I mean, we're not only looking at the oceans, but we're also looking at land use and how we can use existing resources such as mine waste, which in the case of our pilot and some of the test sites that we've been looking at, I mean, there's tens of hundreds of millions of tons of mine waste, which are often hazardous or not desirable for the local community. It's a liability really for mine site owners and operators, and so we can go in there and over time remediate those sites, return them back to productive use, while also addressing these issues such as climate change and ocean acidification. So we see the ACT platform, as we call it, really doing four things. We talked about the hydrogen production as a byproduct through the metallurgy of getting that feedstock for our electrochemical process. We actually have other byproducts such as battery metals, which can be sold to offset the cost of carbon removals. And then, as we've already discussed, the ocean side of it, where we can obviously capture and store carbon in the ocean, but also look at how we can adapt or increase the resilience of things like coral reefs and just restore ocean chemistry. So it's really four things that we say that we do.
And this is where I'm really curious to know what your business model is, because you got a couple of things in there where you got some byproducts you can sell that are actually fairly valuable. And then imagine, since you're capturing and accelerating the storage of carbon, there's some potential carbon credits. So what is your business model?
That's a good question. Ultimately, we see ourselves as a technology company. And so the box is the technology that would be deployed at a mine site. And we would look to license that technology to mine operators or mine site legacy mine owners. And that's essentially what our business will be. But it's going to evolve over time as we get to that stage. In fact, our first customer was actually Shopify, who pre-purchased carbon removal credits from our pilot plant that we're getting up and running right now. And we see that the voluntary carbon market will actually play a critical role in, as we develop and scale up our technology in helping to kickstart essentially the carbon removal market and show that there is a market for carbon. And then over time, as we can prove out the ocean side, the measurement, reporting, verification of carbon in the oceans, and we can certify that pathway, there'll be a switch to selling those carbon credits on the compliance market. And that's where we actually see, hydrogen having a bigger role to play as we scale up, because hydrogen is going to be critical for decarbonization. For us, we see that first at the mine site where we're deploying this technology. But as we scale up and have multiple sites, you'll be able to use that hydrogen for the production of low carbon fuels, or even just directly. And so, for the mine site operator or legacy mine site owner, there's a number of revenue streams that they'll be able to tap into using our device. But ultimately, for us, we're a technology company, and we'll be licensing out that technology.
Yeah, very eloquent, because I can see this primarily this is a way for them to reduce their environmental impact from the tailings and have a solution to do that. And there's so many off streams of basically minimize the cost of actually that remediation effort. So it's quite interesting. And I love what you said too, because I've noticed this pattern where you've got, it takes a bit before you can verify and get on the carbon credit with a verified. And a lot of these forward thinking companies that are out to invest and really lead the industry to show that they're making these changes or investing in a lot of startups like yourselves, and really getting you guys to the point where then you can take advantage of those different markets. So it's quite an interesting development we're seeing now in where you get your funding. Before it was like government grants or so on, but the bigger companies wanting to get those environmental accomplishments are really driving quite a bit of it.
You're absolutely right, Nick. Like we're seeing, even since the company was founded in 2019, where the co-founders really were putting the emphasis on the hydrogen, seeing that as the sort of pathway towards commercialization. The conversation has changed. The markets have changed rapidly when it comes to carbon removals, and also just the recognition that not all carbon removals, and notice I'm not saying carbon offsets, are created equal, and that there's a real need for durable, high quality carbon removals. So understanding that, a lot of these forward-thinking companies, Microsoft, Stripe, Shopify, in our case, have really leaned forward and are paying a premium, understanding, upwards of $2,000 a ton in some some cases, really to get these technologies tested so that we can have them available to us when we know that we're going to need them. But there's a lot of things that have to happen between now and then in order to make this a reality. So we're very optimistic that we can get there, and when we look at how quickly the conversation is developing, maturing, there's a lot of reason to be hopeful that we can make this work.
And just to get a sense, is there and how are you managing the risk? Because here you're taking these vast quantities of something to put into the ocean. So how is that being managed, and how can the ocean take that alkalinity and just to get a sense of the risk management that you're applying there?
Yeah, so I mean, there's several different ways that we're tackling the risk in terms of technology development. Like there's a lot of testing that's going on the metallurgical and electrochemistry side. So that's more, I think, traditional. People can understand how you would develop a technology like that. On the ocean side, there's a lot of research that has to be done. So we have Dr. Will Burt, who leads our ocean research program, and obviously Dr. Greg Rao with over 40 plus years he's a marine biogeochemist. And we basically were partnering with several different institutions. So primarily Dalhousie University in Halifax, which is where our lab is located. We're working with them, University of Miami, under the X Prize carbon removal competition, as well in the UK with Plymouth Marine Laboratories under the UK government's greenhouse gas removal program. In all these instances, we're basically studying an existing outfall and looking at the various impacts in terms of whether, working with Dalhousie, looking at impacts on like phytoplankton or oysters for the addition of alkalinity. Or even just modeling. Our UK work has been largely focused on modeling an existing outfall, looking at how we could add alkalinity using things like wastewater treatment facilities, and then being able to measure and understand that carbon that's fluxing into the ocean. So there's a number of different things. I mentioned University of Miami and coral reefs, but that's still just a drop in the bucket in terms of the overall research that needs to be done. And this was recognized by the National Academies of the Sciences. They recently released a report basically looking at recommending the level of investment that's required in order to answer some of these questions about ocean-based pathways for CDR, not just ocean alkalinity enhancement. And so that report's available, and I would encourage your listeners to take a look at that report and just get a better appreciation of what needs to be done in order to make this a reality.
Just get a sense of like where you are now and what's the next couple of milestones along your pathway to 2035. Just what does that look like currently?
Yeah, it's a good question. As I mentioned, we're moving from the lab and bench scale testing to piloting activities. And so that's going to take a couple of different forms. We've got a pilot 2 different mine sites that we're working with to pilot our metallurgical and electrochemical approach. And so that's going to be over the next 12 months, basically scaling up some of the bench scale testing that we're doing. And as I mentioned, on the ocean side, we're working with some partners in the UK, Miami and Halifax, in order to do some testing on the ocean alkalinity addition. And there the challenge really is, mostly about measurement. In fact, what we've seen from our models is that add this alkalinity and it disperses so quickly that it's hard to actually measure the impact that it has on the local outfall. Of course, we're going to have to be able to validate our models and show that there's carbon being captured, even though we know from our bench scale test that that's the case. So that's really the focus over the next 12 months or so. And that's going to lead to demonstration activities. So 2024 to 2025 is really about operating this process end to end at a commercial scale. And so we're currently, as the piloting is underway and that optimization is taking place, we'll be raising the funds, raising the capital required to go out and build a demonstration scale facility, which will be scaled to remove approximately 1,200 tons of carbon per year from the air through this ocean alkalinity addition using the alkalinity that we're producing. So that's really the plan from now until, I guess, 2025. And from there, I think it'll really depend on sort of how quickly we can accelerate this. We are discussing internally how we could look at rapidly scaling this up. And so we're doing some planning around that. But really the focus is on pilot and demonstration at the time being.
So yeah, so it sounds like kind of towards the end of 2030, you're really then looking at commercialization and really grow into the market. I imagine once you get through the demonstration phase.
Yeah, so I think with the demonstration operating, it'll be very easy for us to show to project partners and then start developing multiple projects at multiple different sites. So we see commercial scale plants, 50,000 tons plus of removal, 2027, 2028. And so we're really aggressively pushing towards that goal. Obviously, to hit 1 billion tons by 2035, it's a 10x to go from 1,000 to 1,000,000, and then 1,000,000 to 1,000,000,000. So it's quite a bit of work that we have ahead of ourselves. But really, like I said, the focus is pilot, demo, and then scale up as rapidly as we can from 2025 onwards.
Yeah, definitely helpful that you've got a design where you've got these multiple revenue streams. I think that'll definitely happen. Help facilitate that mass criminalization, I imagine.
You're right. Ultimately, it comes down to cost, right? And so, there's this sort of $100 per ton benchmark that if we can get to $100 per ton, then it's going to be much more. It'll be cheaper than the alternative in terms of it will make it more. It'll make it cost effective. Sorry, is what I'm trying to say for carbon removals. When we look at it, we think there's potential to get much further below $100 per ton of removal. And that's, as you mentioned, partially because of the other revenue that we can bring in through the process of cleaning up mine tailings, extracting metals that remain in those mine tailings, and then through the production of things like hydrogen.
And just to get a sense too, how does that compare with what else you're seeing on the global scene of anybody else playing in that space of the ocean alkalinity or similar technologies?
We are seeing a bunch of different companies. Well, I shouldn't say a bunch. There are a few different companies that have come into the space in the last year or so, which is great. And some of them are looking at ocean alkalinity enhancement either through removal of carbon from seawater, so electrochemical splitting of seawater, which is not the approach that we're taking, and then returning water that has essentially been deacidified, seawater deacidified back into the ocean. I've seen some visions of offshore plants, if you will, that are looking to remove carbon from seawater electrochemically and then deposit that carbon underneath the ocean floor. There's some really exciting, ambitious ideas out there, and we encourage all those. The more attention people are putting on the space, the more that we as collectively can move the needle in terms of getting the policies and regulations in place to make sure that these kinds of technologies can prosper moving forward and have an impact on climate change. So yeah, I'd say it's an exciting time to be in carbon removal. It's a really exciting time to be in the ocean carbon removal space. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm very optimistic that we're going to be able to figure out how to do this in a cost-effective and very safe way.
What is your company looking for in need of at the moment? Are you looking for expertise or funding, or what would most benefit what you guys are up to at the moment?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and I would encourage listeners to check out our careers page on our website. We are a fast-growing startup. We do have a couple of positions open right now, looking for expertise and to support our metallurgical process development. So check that out. I think that's our most immediate need. This is a deep tech, hard tech type solution. So funding, capital is going to be required, and we will be going out to raise additional funds in the near future. So stay tuned for announcements in terms of fundraising efforts. Expertise and funding is definitely a requirement going forward. And just like more broadly, I would say that we're doing a lot of research in ocean alkalinity enhancement and the measuring, reporting, and verification of carbon fluxing to the ocean. But a lot of work needs to be done in that space as identified by the National Academies in their report and others. And so I think we need to take a look at the policies and regulations that are going to encourage the development and the research that needs to be done, and then eventually the deployment. So, I'm looking at ways at how we can, basically educate policymakers on the potential of this, and then how we can rapidly prove out these pathways so that they are available to us. So that's sort of a larger sort of ecosystem development type need, and there are people that are funding this, mostly philanthropic funding actually that is supporting these activities at the moment, and we see a need for quite a bit more investment, public funding, in order to make sure that the research can keep up and pave the way for these technologies that not just us but other companies are developing to fight climate change.
It's really interesting what you're saying there, because I know the air carbon capture is pretty much hit the mainstream. You're seeing a lot of talk about investment in that, but there's more novel ways where you enhance weathering, ocean alkalinity. They're fairly new, but it seems like there's a lot of potential available through them.
I think direct air capture, like DAC, definitely is going to play a role. It already is. Like the largest carbon removal plant currently in Iceland, Orkling by Climeworks. We're going to need that. But these newer technologies, or DAC 2.0, I've heard called, I think these are the solutions we're going to need to rapidly scale up. And in the case of Planetary Technologies, the leveraging or using the power of the oceans. In fact, there was a Wall Street Journal article that we were featured in on Sunday that kind of gives a good overview. If your listeners are interested, we're going to need to think bigger, and how can we use these natural systems in order to draw down carbon and reestablish that equilibrium. So there's a number of benefits to this solution. One being that it's both the carbon capture and the storage. And then the other ones we've discussed at length throughout the podcast here in terms of the byproducts and environmental co-benefits. But I think DAC is exciting, and it's exciting to see that it's scaling and being deployed. We need to have that to happen faster, and we also need to invest in the R&D required for these newer technologies. Ultimately, we're going to need all of the approaches if we're going to hit 10 billion tons a year by mid-century.
Well, thank you for taking your time and just really sharing with us what you guys are up to. And I really commend you to, really taking these ideas and jumping into the market and what you've done with them so far.
Well, Nick, thank you for your interest and for taking the time to interview us. And for anyone who's interested in more information about Planetary Technologies, I would encourage you to check out our website. It's recently been refreshed, and we've got some cool videos there. And definitely feel free to reach out to me. It's just jason@planetarytech.com. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have, or set up a call, or whatever it is.
Well, I certainly look forward to see what you guys develop in the near future.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you for joining us today. Check us out at www.futureproof-network.com to hear our other episodes, links to our YouTube channel, and to join our Future Proof Business Network. See you again in our next episode.